Colorado Territory, 1875. The plains stretched endlessly under the vast blue sky, promising freedom and solitude in equal measure. For Adam Owens, that solitude had become both shield and prison. At 25, he'd already weathered more hardship than most men twice his age, leaving him with a ranch that demanded everything and gave back just enough to survive. The isolation suited him fine. At least that's what he told himself on nights when the only conversation came from howling coyotes and the crackling fire. A man's only true companion out here is the land, Adam often said to his small herd of cattle as he worked. Get too attached to people, and you're just inviting heartache. It was a philosophy born from watching his parents' slow decline after drought took their crops 3 years running. His father had died still clutching his mother's hand, proving, to Adam's mind, that love couldn't feed you or save you from the frontier's harsh judgment. Spring had come early to the foothills where his modest ranch sat. Adam stood on his porch, lean and tall, the morning sun highlighting his strong jaw and the golden hints in his brown hair. His youth still showed in the smoothness of his face, though his hazel eyes carried the weight of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. The ranch needed many things: more cattle, better fencing, perhaps another hand for the busy seasons. But Adam had convinced himself that self-reliance was the only currency worth having in this wild country. Trust got you killed out west. Dependence on others was weakness he couldn't afford. What he couldn't admit, even to himself under the endless starlit nights, was the creeping emptiness that followed him from task to task. The conversations he rehearsed with no one. The second cup of coffee he sometimes poured before remembering there was no one to drink it. As he saddled his horse for the day's ride, checking fence lines along the eastern property, Adam had no way of knowing that his carefully constructed philosophy was about to be challenged by the most unexpected encounter of his life. The settlement of Pine Creek was hardly more than a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence along the stage road. A general store, a saloon, a smithy, and a handful of other establishments serving the scattered ranches and homesteads of the region. Adam typically avoided town except for absolute necessities, but spring supplies and seeds couldn't wait. He tied his horse outside Whitman's general store and was examining a new axe handle when shouting erupted from the saloon across the dusty street. Most townsfolk barely glanced up. Drunken arguments were common enough, but something about the particular tone made Adam pause. $5. That's my final offer for the girl, bellowed a gruff voice. She ain't worth half that. Deaf as a fence post and twice as useless, came the slurred response. Adam stepped onto the boardwalk, squinting across at the saloon where a large man in a filthy coat was gesturing wildly at a thin, disheveled older man. Between them stood a young woman, head bowed, her light brown dress dusty and worn at the hem. Even from a distance, Adam could see her hands were trembling. Not my fault you fathered a worthless girl, the large man spat. $3 then. Something twisted in Adam's gut, a feeling he'd thought long buried. Before he could reason himself out of it, he was crossing the street, boots kicking up dust with each determined stride. The scene came into sharper focus as he approached. The young woman's hair was a rich auburn, falling past her shoulders in waves despite its neglect. She couldn't have been more than 20, with a delicate profile and eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Her father, Adam presumed from the conversation, swayed dangerously, the stench of whiskey emanating from him like heat from a stove. What's happening here? Adam asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. The large man, a cattle buyer named Henson who had a reputation for unsavory deals, smirked. Private business, Owens. Move along. Trying to buy myself some help, the drunk man slurred. This one's my daughter. Patricia. Pretty enough, but born wrong. He made a crude gesture toward his ear. Can't hear a damn thing. Makes her cheap, though. Patricia flinched, but didn't look up, her hands now clasped tightly before her. Adam felt something dark and protective rise within him. You're selling your own daughter? What business is it of yours? The father sneered. Man's got rights to what's his. She's a person, not property, Adam said, the words surprising even himself. Henson laughed. Since when did you become the territory's conscience, Owens? Last I heard, you barely speak to another living soul if you can help it. The drunk man squinted at Adam, then at his daughter. Something calculating entered his bloodshot eyes. You want her instead? She can cook and clean well enough if you show her what to do. Getting tired of her moping around anyway. Adam looked at Patricia, really looked at her, and saw something in the rigid set of her shoulders that reminded him of himself, someone who'd learned to expect nothing good from the world. In that moment, the absurdity of what he was about to do barely registered. How much? The words left his mouth before he could reconsider. The drunk laughed. For you? $1. That's all she's worth to me now. Patricia's head snapped up at this, and for a brief moment, her eyes met Adam's. They were a startling shade of green, wide with a mix of fear and something else, intelligence, awareness, dignity holding on by a thread. Something fundamental shifted in Adam's world at that moment, though he wouldn't understand it until much later. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, tossing it to the man. Done, he said. Patricia, gather your things. You're coming with me. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Patricia sat behind him on his horse, her small bundle of possessions tied to the saddle. Her hands gripped the back of his coat lightly, maintaining the barest contact necessary to stay seated. Adam had attempted to communicate with gestures and slow, exaggerated words, but her responses were minimal, a nod, a slight movement of her head. As they crested the hill overlooking his property, Adam pointed to the modest cabin, the small barn, and the corrals. The spring sun was setting, painting the scene in hues of gold and amber. It wasn't much, but it was solid, built by his own hands after his parents passed. Home, he said clearly, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear him. When they dismounted, Patricia stood awkwardly in the yard, her green eyes taking in everything with a watchfulness that spoke of someone accustomed to navigating an unpredictable world. Adam showed her to the small room off the main living area. It had been meant for storage, but a narrow bed and chest of drawers made it habitable. He gestured for her to settle in while he prepared a simple meal. The reality of what he'd done was beginning to sink in. He'd brought a stranger, a young woman, into his home on a reckless impulse. The isolation he'd cultivated so carefully now seemed fractured by her quiet presence. That night, lying in his own bed, Adam stared at the ceiling and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The frontier was no place for impulsive decisions. People who survived out here planned, calculated, weighed every risk. They certainly didn't bring home young women purchased for $1 from their drunken fathers. But something about her eyes, about the quiet dignity she maintained even in that humiliating moment, had awakened a protective instinct he thought long dead. Just until she has somewhere better to go, he whispered to himself. Just until then. The first week established an awkward routine. Adam wrote simple notes and used gestures to show Patricia what needed doing. She proved capable in the kitchen, transforming his basic provisions into surprisingly appetizing meals. She seemed to understand his written requests, confirming she could read, though she never wrote back. He found himself watching her when she didn't notice. The careful way she folded laundry, the gentle handling of the chickens when collecting eggs, how she'd pause sometimes to look out across the land with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was a grace to her movements that seemed at odds with the harsh circumstances that had brought her to his ranch. On the 8th day, Adam was repairing a broken chair on the porch when he happened to glance through the window. Patricia was humming quietly to herself as she kneaded bread dough, a faint melody that drifted through the open window. He froze, the realization striking him like a physical blow. A deaf woman wouldn't hum a melody. He set down his tools and walked quietly into the house. Patricia's back was to him, her auburn hair tied back with a piece of ribbon he'd found for her among his mother's things. She continued humming, completely unaware of his presence, until he deliberately scraped his boot against the floor. She whirled around, eyes wide, flour dusting her hands and the worn blue dress she'd been wearing when he brought her home. "You can hear," Adam said, no longer exaggerating his words or gestures. Patricia's face paled, her green eyes darting toward the door as if calculating an escape. Then, seeming to reach some internal decision, she straightened her spine and met his gaze directly for the first time. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I can hear." Adam felt a surge of confusion and something close to betrayal. "You've been pretending all this time?" "What?" Patricia Anders looked down at her flour-covered hands, then back up at him, chin raised slightly. Because being deaf was safer than being able to hear what my father and his friends said. Being deaf meant they didn't expect me to answer. Being deaf meant... She took a deep breath. It meant I was less valuable to men like Henson. The implication hung in the air between them. Adam felt sick at the thought of what might have happened had he not intervened that day. "How long have you been pretending?" he asked more gently. 3 years. Since my mother died." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "My father started drinking heavily after that. I learned quickly that being thought of as damaged was safer than being whole." Adam ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this revelation. "And you've continued the pretense here. With me." "I didn't know you," Patricia said simply. "I didn't know if you'd be kind or cruel once you got me home. I didn't know what you expected in exchange for that dollar." A slight flush colored her cheeks at the implication. "I don't expect anything," Adam said quickly, then more firmly. "Nothing like that. I just couldn't leave you there." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched Patricia's lips. "I've noticed. You've been nothing but respectful. Even when you thought I couldn't hear you." Adam realized with a jolt that she'd heard everything he'd muttered to himself over the past week. His frustrations with the cattle, his complaints about the spring mud, perhaps even the way he'd catch himself talking through decisions as if explaining them to someone else. "I should have told you sooner," she continued. "But habits of survival are hard to break." Adam nodded slowly, understanding filling him. The frontier taught everyone protective measures. Hers was simply different from his own isolation. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we should properly introduce ourselves then. I'm Adam Owens." Her smile grew a fraction wider. "Patricia Anders. Though everyone used to call me Patty." "Patty," he repeated, the name feeling right on his tongue. "Welcome to the ranch, properly this time." The revelation changed everything and nothing. The daily work continued. Cattle needed tending, repairs demanded attention, supplies required management. But now their interactions were punctuated with conversation. Adam discovered Patty had a quick mind and a dry humor that emerged slowly, like a wildflower cautiously blooming after frost. She told him of growing up in Illinois, of her mother's death from fever, of her father's decision to head west in search of opportunity that never materialized. Adam shared stories of his own parents, of learning ranching from his father, of the drought years and their passing within months of each other. "You've been alone ever since?" Patty asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Adam nodded. "Seemed easier that way." "Easier isn't always better," she observed quietly. He glanced at her profile, softened in the golden light. At 22, Patty had weathered hardships that should have broken her spirit, yet there remained something essentially undefeated in her bearing. It stirred something in him that he'd thought long buried. Admiration, yes, but something more dangerous too. "Why did you really do it?" she asked suddenly. "By me, I mean." Adam considered the question. The truth was, he still wasn't entirely sure himself. "I couldn't stand the way they were talking about you. Like you weren't even there. Like you weren't." He struggled to find the right words. "A person," she supplied. "Yes, and something in your eyes. You looked..." He hesitated. "Trapped," she finished for him. "I was." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Adam felt a connection that transcended words. Two people who understood what it meant to build walls against the world, who recognized the same defensive architecture in each other. Spring progressed into early summer. Adam taught Patty to ride his gentlest mare, watching her confidence grow as she mastered the skill. She surprised him one day by showing her proficiency with his father's old rifle, explaining that her mother had insisted she learn to shoot. "A woman alone needs protection," she'd said matter-of-factly, hitting a tin can set on a fence post at 40 yards. "You're not alone anymore." Adam had responded without thinking, then felt his face warm at the implication. Patty had simply smiled, a small, mysterious expression that stayed with him through the night. The change in their relationship happened so gradually that Adam almost missed it. The way they began to anticipate each other's needs, the comfortable silences that no longer felt empty, the casual touches that seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary. The ranch felt different too, more like a home than simply a place of work. One evening in late June, they sat at the table after dinner. Adam was calculating figures for the cattle he hoped to purchase come fall, while Patty mended one of his shirts. The domestic scene struck him suddenly. How quickly he'd grown accustomed to her presence, how the once empty cabin now felt properly inhabited. "I should pay you," he said abruptly, setting down his pencil. Patty looked up from her stitching, eyebrows raised. "Pay me? For your work here? It's not right that you're just—" He trailed off, realizing how it might sound. "Just what? Your property." Her voice held no accusation, only a gentle prodding. Adam flushed. "That's not how I think of you." "How do you think of me, Adam?" she asked, setting aside her mending. The question hung between them, demanding an honesty he wasn't sure he was ready to give. But her steady gaze wouldn't allow evasion. "As someone I don't want to leave," he admitted finally. "As someone who's become important to me." Patty's expression softened. "I don't want to leave either." Something shifted in the air between them, a barrier dissolving. Adam reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Her skin was warm, slightly rough from work, completely real. "I thought I needed to be alone to survive out here," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Patty turned her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. "We both were." That night, Adam lay awake long after they'd said goodnight, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling and thinking about how completely his carefully constructed solitude had been dismantled by a woman who'd entered his life through the strangest of circumstances. July brought scorching heat and the first real test of their emerging partnership. Word came from a passing rider that cattle rustlers had been working the area, hitting isolated ranches where resistance would be minimal. Adam doubled his vigilance, riding fence lines daily and keeping his rifle close. "You should go into town until this passes," he told Patty one morning as he prepared to ride out. "Stay at the boarding house. I can pay for a room." She looked at him as if he'd suggested something absurd. "This is my home too now. I'm not leaving you to face trouble alone." The simplicity of her declaration, "my home too," left him momentarily speechless. When had that happened? When had his solitary existence expanded to include her so completely? It could be dangerous, he warned. Patty checked the load in her rifle with practiced ease. "Life is dangerous, Adam. Especially for a woman on her own. At least here, we face it together." He couldn't argue with that logic, nor could he deny the relief he felt knowing she would be there when he returned each evening. They established a system. Patty would fire 3 shots if trouble approached while he was away, and he would do the same to signal his return. The precautions proved necessary sooner than expected. 3 days later, Adam returned from checking the north pasture to find fresh hoofprints circling the cabin. Heart pounding, he approached cautiously, rifle ready. Patty met him at the door, her own rifle in hand. 3 men, she reported quietly. They rode up claiming to be lost, asking for water and directions. Something didn't feel right about them. "What happened?" Adam asked, scanning the surrounding area. "I kept them outside, gave them water, but made sure they saw this." She patted the rifle. "One of them recognized me from town. Said something about the deaf girl who can suddenly hear." Her voice remained steady, but Adam saw the fear she was controlling. "They left, but I don't think they've gone far." Adam's protective instinct flared. "Your father must have told people about the deception. They might think that I'm alone and vulnerable," Patty finished. "Or that you paid for more than just household help." The implications hung in the air between them. A young woman living with a man outside of marriage already invited speculation. Add in the circumstances of her arrival, and the situation became fodder for the worst kind of frontier gossip. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Adam insisted Patty take the first sleep, promising to wake her at midnight. When her breathing had deepened into sleep, he studied her face in the soft glow of the banked fire. The fierce protectiveness he felt surprised him with its intensity. It wasn't just concern for a friend or employee. It was something deeper, something he'd been avoiding naming. He was falling in love with her. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was assembling. The rustlers made their move 2 nights later. The moon was new, providing cover of darkness as they approached the corral where Adam kept his best horses. Patty heard them first, the soft nickering of disturbed horses, the muffled curse when someone stumbled. She woke Adam with a hand over his mouth, a finger to her lips. They moved in practiced coordination, taking positions at different windows, rifles ready. 3 of them, Adam whispered. "By the corral. Same ones who came before," Patty confirmed. Her eyes narrowed as she made out shapes in the darkness. Adam's mind raced. 3 against 2 weren't ideal odds, especially when the two included a young woman who, despite her skill with a rifle, had never faced this kind of violence. "Stay here," he instructed. "If they rush the cabin, shoot through the door. And let you face them alone?" "No." Her voice was firm. "We do this together." Before he could argue further, one of the men approached the barn door. Adam raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the ground near the man's feet. "That's far enough," he called out. "The next one goes higher." Chaos erupted. The rustlers scattered, taking cover and returning fire. Bullets splintered wood around the cabin windows. Patty remained steady beside him, firing with careful precision when one of the men exposed himself. "We just want the horses, Owens," a voice called out. "And maybe a little time with your woman." Rage flooded Adam at the threat. He squeezed off another shot, gratified to hear a yelp of pain in response. The firefight continued for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes. Then, a shifting of shadows indicated the rustlers were retreating toward their horses. "They're leaving," Patty said, relief evident in her voice. "Stay down," Adam warned. "Could be a trick." They waited, tense and alert, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did Adam lower his rifle, turning to Patty with concern etched across his features. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. "No," she assured him, though her hands trembled slightly from the aftermath of danger. "You?" "I'm fine." He moved to light the lamp, needing to see her clearly, to confirm with his eyes what she'd told him with words. In the golden light, her face was pale but composed, her auburn hair falling loose around her shoulders where it had escaped its braid during the night. Relief made him reckless. Adam crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. Patty stiffened momentarily in surprise, then melted against him, her arms encircling his waist. "I thought." He couldn't finish the thought, the possibility too awful to voice. "I know," she murmured against his shirt. "Me too." When they pulled apart, something had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved in the face of shared danger. Adam looked down at her, at the woman who'd fought beside him without hesitation, and found himself unable to hold back the truth any longer. "Patty," he said softly, "I don't want to pretend anymore either." She looked up at him, understanding dawning in her green eyes. "What are you pretending?" "That I'm not in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. For one terrible moment, Adam thought he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then Patty's face transformed, a smile breaking across it like sunrise over the mountains. "Good," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Because I don't want to pretend I'm not in love with you either." When their lips met, it felt like coming home to a place Adam hadn't known he was seeking. Patty's mouth was soft under his, her body warm and real in his arms. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the connection between them. Later, as dawn broke over the eastern hills, they sat together on the porch, watching the light reclaim their land. Patty's head rested against Adam's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "We need to go to town today," he said quietly. "Those men will be back, probably with others." Patty nodded. "I know. And while we're there," Adam continued, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest, "we should speak to the preacher." She looked up at him, eyes questioning. "If you'll have me," he clarified. "As your husband." Joy bloomed across her face. "Are you certain? After knowing what I am, what I did. What you are is the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known," Adam said firmly. "What you did was survive. And now I'm asking if you'll do me the honor of building a life with me. Properly. No more dollar transactions or pretending." Patty laughed, the sound bright and free in the morning air. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." The town of Pine Creek had never seen a wedding quite like theirs. Hastily arranged though it was, the entire settlement turned out, curious about the reclusive rancher and the woman who'd arrived under such unusual circumstances. Patty wore a dress borrowed from the storekeeper's wife, with wildflowers in her hair. Adam had splurged on a new shirt and had actually polished his boots. They stood before the preacher in the small church, speaking vows that felt like secrets they'd already shared. "I thought the frontier was a place where a man had to stand alone to survive," Adam said when it came time for his promises. "You showed me that real strength comes from standing together." Patty, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, responded, "I pretended to be deaf so I wouldn't have to hear the cruelty in the world. You made me want to hear everything again, every word, every promise, every moment of our life together." The wedding was followed by a hasty return to the ranch, now reinforced by the presence of 3 men from town who had volunteered to help Adam stand against the rustlers should they return. The show of community support surprised him. Apparently, his neighbors had been waiting for him to need them all along. The rustlers did return 4 days later, this time finding not an isolated rancher and a vulnerable woman, but a defended homestead with 6 armed men and one particularly determined bride who could shoot as well as any of them. The confrontation was brief and decisive, ending with 2 rustlers wounded and all of them riding away considerably faster than they'd arrived. As summer faded into fall, Adam and Patty Owens established themselves as a formidable partnership. The ranch began to prosper under their combined efforts. His knowledge of cattle and her skill with gardens and accounts. They built a larger chicken coop, expanded the vegetable garden, and added a proper front porch where they could sit together in the evenings. By winter, the cabin had been transformed. Curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt covered their bed, and the smells of home cooking regularly filled the rooms. Adam found himself talking more, laughing more, planning for a future that now felt limitless rather than lonely. One snowy evening, as they sat before the fire, Patty looked up from her sewing with an expression that made Adam pause. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside the harness he was mending. "I've been thinking about family," she said carefully. "About making our own." Adam felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. The thought of a child, their child, running through the rooms of their home, learning to ride, growing up loved and secure, was almost too beautiful to contemplate. "Are you saying?" he began, hardly daring to hope. Patty smiled, radiant in the firelight. "Not yet, but soon, I think, if you're ready." Adam crossed to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I never thought I could have this," he admitted. "A home that feels complete. Someone to love who loves me back. The possibility of children. I thought those things weren't meant for men like me. And I never thought I could stop pretending," Patty said softly. "Stop hiding. Be fully seen and still be loved." Adam kissed her then, pouring into it all the gratitude and wonder he felt at their unlikely journey. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "From $1 to priceless," he murmured. "Best transaction I ever made." Patty laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "Careful, Mr. Owens. That sounds dangerously close to owning me again." "Never," he said seriously. "You own just as much of me as I ever could of you." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their ranch in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the home they'd created together. They had found in each other what the harsh frontier tried to deny them, that even in the wildest places, love could take root and flourish, transforming isolation into connection and loneliness into belonging. For Adam Owens, who once believed the frontier was no place for love, and Patricia Anders, who had pretended deafness to survive a cruel world, the greatest discovery was that sometimes, in the most unexpected circumstances, what seems like an ending becomes the most beautiful beginning. By spring, when the first wildflowers pushed through the melting snow, the Owens Ranch had become known throughout the region not just for its fine horses or increasing herd of cattle, but for the remarkable story of its owners, a lonely rancher and a woman who'd found her voice, building together what neither could have created alone, a true home on the wild frontier.